when he said that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. Obviously, he didn't have gold or the monetary world or financial problems in mind, having just created the nuclear bomb. But I think, to my mind, this is entirely appropriate with what we're going through. The problem today is too much debt, and we're trying to solve it with more debt. So it seems to me that Einstein's wisdom should be considered a little bit more in getting us out of this difficult period. I've been arguing now for 5 years that, and even more so since 2008, when we had the global crisis. I hate saying had, because I never thought it ended. We were just going through a period of, if you like, calm, as in the eye of a storm. I think we are still in a global financial crisis, which is re-emerging and stronger. But all these crises that are the focus of the media, credit crisis, banking crisis, financial crisis, and now, of course, sovereign debt crisis, are very real indeed. But to my mind, they're simply manifestation of what is the underlying cause of all of them, is that money is dying. Our monetary system has been an experiment that has failed in human history every time before, and this is the first time it's been attempted on a global basis. So it's bound to fail again, I would argue, and so it's time for some important reform. Our dear friend Alan Greenspan again, but more recently, in September 2010, said something quite interesting in a Q&A session at a speech he gave to the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington. He said, fiat money has no place to go but gold. If all currencies are moving up or down together, the question is, relative to what? Gold is the canary in the coal mine. It signals problems with respect to currency markets. Central banks should pay attention to it. So, there you have it from the man who was in charge of the Fed for many, many years. Fiat money has no place to go but gold. And it seems to be a growing belief out there that we need to either go back to a gold standard or somehow bring back gold in the equation, maybe as a part of the basket that defines the special drawing rights of the IMF. Whatever, we'll see where that goes, but we will see gold coming back into the system. So what we have had now for 40 years is effectively an irredeemable currencies monetary regime. And if you think about it, if you don't have the ability to redeem your money on demand for what a gold standard would determine to be the fixed weight of that metal, then as a result, that money, that paper money, is only as good as the ability of the issuing state to pay its debts. That brings a number of corollary questions given the sovereign debt crisis these days and the fast rising official or funded national debt of the U.S. But not only that, the underlying currencies of all financial assets are only as good as the belief you have as an investor or the holder of those assets that the issuing central bank will preserve the value of that currency. And with the vast amount of money printing or increased money supply or the monetary base, QE1, QE2, will we have QE3? We certainly don't at the moment, but it seems very likely that we will have to go to some form of additional creation of money. So at the end of the day, when you think about it, money is now really entirely dependent on confidence that the central bankers have all this under control. I have a slide here on the U.S. debt, not to be tough on the U.S. more than other countries, but since the U.S. continues to have the privilege of having the global reserve currency, which is a legacy of the Bretton Woods, which perhaps should no longer be the case, you could argue, given that the U.S. dollar is no longer redeemable for gold. Maybe it should be something else as a global reserve currency, or maybe the U.S. dollar as well as other currencies. These are very important questions. I don't have an answer here, but given that the U.S. has that privilege still, it's very important to look at the situation of the U.S. debt. Much of the attention is placed on the Euro nations, in particular Greece these days. But I would argue that the situation with the U.S. debt is far, far more important than that. And I've got a series of bullet points here on the U.S. debt that are all facts. And it never ceases to amaze me how even
the point was just made that this is already obsolete. True, this was late September. The debt is over 15 trillion now.
The first bullet point on this particular slide seems to be unknown by investment professionals as well as people from the investing public.
Yes. I think the important thing to understand, though, with the US is they do actually have the ability to repay. They can actually earn their way out of it with the size of their economy.
I would beg to differ with that.
You don't think they can earn their way out of it?
No, not at the size of the debt that they've now accumulated. Well, first of all, they haven't paid a single dollar
I understand
for 50 years. So, and the servicing of the debt is becoming more and more of a burden, especially when you add to the debt. You know, the super committee couldn't even come to cutting the future deficits by 100 billion a year. And as we speak, the debt increases by over 200 billion a month in the U.S. So, no, I just don't think that they have that ability at all, and they don't intend to pay it back.
Yeah, one thing I can add to that 15 trillion is not the full reckoning.
No.
Any private business that kept their books that way, their financial officers would be in prison for fraud. So first of all, Congress granted unlimited backstops to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac of the housing bubble fame. And so you have to put that debt on the U.S. government books for sure. That's another 6 trillion, I think.
No, absolutely. This is just the federal government funded debt, public funded debt. That's all it is. So there's a lot more debt. Unfunded liabilities.
Fannie and Freddie is actually part of that, I think.
No, it's not.
No, it's not included in that, but I think it ought to be included in there.
Well, it ought to.
Now, Social Security and Medicare is another 80 or 90 or 100 trillion. Arguably, that's not a liability because Congress could change how much they're going to pay on those programs. But my point is, I think it's actually about 25 trillion is the actual debt that the government at present owes.
And that's just the federal.
And that's just the federal, not including the states and the cities and everybody else.
But don't we have to also say that if they started to repay the debt, somebody else had to start being the new debtor of the world, because otherwise the system would get unstable. Because if America starts repaying debt, then
they have absolutely no interest. Wouldn't worry about it. They have no interest. They have no interest in paying the debt because the monetary system thrives on debt, and the debt needs to increase for the system to work. So it's not going to happen.
Louis, it's not possible to pay the debt because debt is money, and if debt is retired, the money retires with it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
exactly.
It's called debt.
The mind boggles, doesn't it?
The national debt of the U.S. has been increasing ever since 1961, or in other words, none of the principal of the debt has been repaid since then. So that's 50 years of increasing debt. It took just under 200 years for the U.S. to accumulate the first trillion in debt. Seems like an awful long time to accumulate 1 trillion, a number that is incomprehensible for most. One nice image for me of trying to capture what a trillion is if you had been born the day Jesus Christ was born, and you had spent $1 million a day, and were still alive today, you would have still not spent $1 trillion. That's how big that number is. The U.S. national debt stood at 10.6 trillion the day current President of the United States, Barack Obama, took office. And since he took office, which is less than 4 years ago, already he has added, or under his administration, there has been an extra 4.2 trillion added in debt. And so the debt now stands in the U.S. at 14.8 trillion. And the ceiling is 15.2 trillion. 15.2 trillion. So we're not far already from that ceiling. How did that 15.2 trillion amount got calculated? Everybody was very aware that there was a 14.3 trillion debt ceiling before August the 2nd. But what happened on August the 2nd was effectively the 93rd increase. It's happened many, many times, making more or less this concept of having a debt ceiling a bit of a joke, really, to be quite honest, since it gets raised every time the ceiling, the debt approaches the ceiling. But on the 2nd of August, we had an innovative, I'll have on the 2nd of August, what happened is that Congress approved 400 billion increase immediately, with an extra layer of 500 billion if certain conditions were met, and then third layer of 1.5 trillion if again further conditions are met. So really the ceiling was increased potentially by as much as 2.4 trillion, the highest increase ever, although the previous increase in early 2010 was almost as high, 2 trillion. So the 400 billion was spent in August, and the second tranche of 500 billion is already in place, although there has been very little media attention given to that, certainly not as much as the circus that went on in July or heading towards the 2nd of August. These are huge amounts, and if you look at those numbers, you can really see that since the beginning of the global financial crisis in 2008, it's been more than 5 trillion that has been added to the U.S. debt ceiling. That is an enormous amount. It becomes clearer and clearer by the day that the U.S. will be unable to pay that debt unless the currency in which the debt is denominated is debased very, very significantly. So I believe we must challenge the beliefs we operate under. We are held to believe that central bankers can and will do miracles. I would argue that they certainly appear to do miracles, but what they are doing, in fact, is buying time and not solving ultimately the root of the problem. Governments can default on their debt has been a widely held assumption in the investment world, certainly as for the major sovereign governments. We are certainly seeing the possibility of that no longer being the case very soon. Big debate as to whether we have inflation or deflation. We have both that are manifesting in different sectors of the markets and of the economy. One thing always observe when I travel and give this presentation in different countries is that inevitably the country I'm speaking in thinks that they're in a better situation than others, money-wise, in terms of the central banks or the inflation. We're all in the same boat because all currencies are fiat-only money and are measured only in relative terms. There is no absolute value for money today. So one thing I try to encourage all my clients to do, that certainly I do, is to try to account for values, whether that's assets or liabilities, in another form of money than the currencies you're investing in or investing from, and therefore measure the value or the price of your assets in gold ounces. And here's a chart that's probably one of the most quoted chart when it comes to using gold as a unit of account or value measure. It's the Dow gold ratio, which shows how many ounces of gold you would have needed over time to buy the Dow. And it goes to, this chart covers over 200 years, from 1800 to today, and it kind of divides it into two eras, the pre-Federal Reserve, so pre-1913, and post-1913, or what you could argue pre- and post change of having gold in the center of the monetary system to not having gold at the center of the system. The two things you can observe very quickly on this chart is that, of course, it takes more and more gold to buy the equity market, which makes sense, of course, because the equity market is a representation of production and growth in the economy, and so that should be the case. But there has been much more volatile outcomes since the introduction of the Fed, and we have seen some peaks and throws that seem to indicate that we're going back to a situation where we'll have a Dow gold ratio of 1 again, which has always been the bottom of this cycle. And this chart also shows that although the Dow is, in dollar terms, not far below its peak in 2000, it is significantly lower than that peak when measured in gold ounces. In 2000, it took 44 ounces of gold to buy the Dow. Now it takes 6.5 ounces. So it's an interesting chart, and the same thing can be done with any other share market or capital market or other asset. Another chart that is widely used, another asset that gold is often used as.
Is that not just entirely the currency effect, though? I mean, because corporate America has still added value. I mean, you're essentially, what that implies to me is you're saying corporate America hasn't added value, whereas I just disagree with that. Isn't that just all currency effect? The debasement of the US dollar and what you're measuring corporate America has occurred at a faster rate than growth in corporate profits over time.
What you call corporate America in relation to that chart is an index of stocks traded on the marketplace, that index being measured in dollars.
Yeah. So
all this does is it changes the measure from dollars to gold ounces as a means of purchasing the index or not. It simply demonstrates that if you were to discipline yourself to consider how well you're doing by investing in corporate America in a different currency, you would probably get a different picture. And it's
because if you put that in Swiss francs, it'd be a different story, right? If you put it down in Swiss francs, it's a very different picture.
Well, I don't know that it would be very different at all. But I wouldn't do that. I would use the Swiss index, which is measured in Swiss francs, and convert that in Swiss indexed gold ratio. Because that's the point of that chart, is to take any index, this being the Dow index, so U.S. equity market index, measured in U.S. dollars. So you can do it to the New Zealand index, New Zealand Stock Exchange index, or the Swiss index. But then you need to convert that in the price of gold in that currency, and then you see what you get. You'll get a similar picture.
To measure the price is housing, and the average house price in the U.S. has dropped from 600 ounces of gold to less than 100 ounces of gold as we speak, and that should be the bottom, as most historically that has been about where it's come back up. Speaking of money and measures, what strikes me as really interesting, probably more initially from a philosophical point of view, but really a fundamental point of view, is that we have many measures of the aggregate supply of money to choose from, and that we can track and use in our analysis. But there is absolutely nothing to be found anywhere in terms of the absolute measure of money, and this is what's lacking. We do not have any known absolute value of money as we speak. Everything is measured relative to everything else. So we have the currency exchange rates, and therefore we have a lot of uncertainty. And when you think about it, when it comes to measurement in any scientific endeavor, measurement is very precise, and is there'll be a convention as to what a second is, or a meter, or a degree Celsius, or whatever, and therefore the measurement is fixed. And the tendency in any area of endeavor, scientific endeavor, is to aim to improve the precision of that unit of measure. The only exception in science, assuming economics is a science, is monetary economics. Fiat money floats. It's an elastic measure. So I would argue that that is part of the reason, if not the core reason, of why we have such difficulty these days and uncertainty. If it was a problem, an isolated problem, it wouldn't be so serious, but we're talking here about currencies that all financial assets are denominated in. So it's a real concern, and when you invest for yourself or for your clients, you need to be conscious of that. You need to protect yourself from this great uncertainty and debasement of ongoing debasement of currencies. So how do you do that? You have to diversify away from fiat currencies. And before I get into the bullion market or means of investing in gold, I want to demonstrate that this has happened in the past. And one of the driving, it would appear, reasons for people to prefer gold over other assets, or if you look at the price of gold as a manifestation of the increasing demand for it, is when interest rates are in the negative real area. So that's what happened in the 70s. I think that was the main driver for the demand in gold, and that is what has been happening over the last 10 years. And every indication that this is likely to continue, with statements from central banks that interest rates will remain low until 2013, and therefore negative in real terms relative to inflation. So something to watch very carefully is real interest rates, and if they remain negative, well, likelihood that the gold price will continue to go up. The interesting historical point here is that Isaac Newton was the first master of the mint, the Royal Mint in London, and he was obviously a scientist and was the first to make it very clear that if we're going to measure money using gold as a standard, we need to define the unit. And this is what we don't have anymore. We do not have a unit of measure for our global monetary system. It used to be 1/35 of an ounce of gold for $1. In fact, that was a definition of the US dollar in the Bretton Woods. It wasn't that gold was worth $35 an ounce. That's a misinterpretation of it. It was the dollar was defined as 1/35 of an ounce. That was the measure of the unit. So I would argue that it's important to own some bullion, and by that I mean the physical metal, and more on that in a minute, as opposed to investing in exchange-traded funds or supposed.
I realize it's 4:30, so we can stop it there, because on Friday I will be talking about bullion and the various alternative ways of investing or accessing ownership of gold. So let's stop it there, and happy to take any questions if you have any, or if you haven't fallen completely asleep. But this is what I say to investment professionals in order to capture their attention to the importance of what's going on, and maybe that they should consider bullion ownership as a means of protection, or at least, at the very least, consider that they are fully exposed to fiat currency debasement, because all the financial assets that are in investment portfolios are denominated in one or another currency, and that's the main gist of it. So,
yeah, just one of the slides that you put up, KC Research, I think.
Yeah, Bud Conrad KC
Just
Research.
estimate how much gold should be valued at. It was 10,000, I think you put up. I didn't read the detail of that research, but just for your comment, I read Mike Maloney, I think. He, in 2006, he did research on a static way of value the gold. He looked at before 1971, all central banks in the world were allowed to convert the paper money, the debt on US dollar, go back to US and convert to gold.
Yeah.
Gold would have to be 20,000 US dollar per ounce if using a static way. $20,000, 19,000 something, we call it 20,000. And he said that's based on Bretton Woods before 1971. Only central bank allowed to go back to US and take the US gold if they had the 8,000 tons. The other way that he come up with, all fiat money in the world, you were to convert to gold based on the central bank of the world having the gold deposit in your world, that will be $100,000 per ounce. Of course, this is static, because when gold price go up, the 160,000 tons might come out from hoarding or hiding. So this is a static way that he come up with that figure. Quite interesting, it's a different figure.
Yes, well, of course, there are many ways to proceed in valuing or coming up with a price for gold, and those are some of them. And you end up with a whole range. Yeah. But I thought Bud's approach was quite interesting, and also because there recently has been 2 or 3 other researchers on this matter that have come to a similar sort of price for the existing amount of paper reserves, around 10,000. So that's before there is even more creation of credit. But the point of that was just to demonstrate that it is possible that the price is undervalued. Sandy.
I have a slightly different calculation in that you can't look at aggregate paper assets and then look at some kind of ratio, because gold is strictly base money. So you have to look at demand deposits across the entire global system and amortize that only against gold. But obviously the amount of demand deposits depends on how much bond monetization you'll do. You know, so, but I come to a figure of around $5,000 at the moment. Changing data.
Well, but the point, Sandeep, I think, isn't it, that whether you take your approach, that approach, that's based on the situation today, which is a higher price than it currently is, and all likelihood is that it's going to keep going in that direction because of what authorities are doing.
Well, this is another case of positive feedback. When gold became money, there was feedback over centuries that as soon as gold became monetized, became more and more accepted as money, became better and better. Here it's a debt runaway positive feedback. The more debt you have, the tougher it is to pay back. And at some point, you either revalue your dollar, you do something, or you just pretend it isn't there. And then obviously people are pretending it isn't there, the problem. So it's a runaway feedback, positive feedback. So you got to stop it somewhere else to explode. Runaway machine.
Well, I think that we're pretty much all in agreement with that here, but this presentation doesn't generate much action in the industry, I can tell you. But it has been listened to and you know, watched by many.
We're waiting for the next guy, for somebody to start.
Yeah, we're waiting for the snap, the elasticity, you know. We're waiting for the snap. Well, thank you very much for today, and tomorrow we kick off at 10 a.m. sharp. Thank you.